Hi, and welcome back. We're going to be covering Chapter 12 in this section. And just as an introduction, if you remember in Chapter 11, we talked about forecasting demand, which is the first step in the master planning cycle. Once you forecast your demand, capacity planning is the second step in the cycle, which means after you estimate what your needs are going to be, you want to make sure that you have the capabilities to perform and deliver on those needs. In Chapter 12, we will focus on facilities, several other aggregate planning and specific planning concepts, and relate some of the strategies to costs. You always want to be aware of the sequence and relationship of any of our topics in a systematic sense. This is especially true when you're dealing with facilities and operations, because there are drivers. We deal with facilities so we know what our capabilities are. We translate our demand into aggregate planning that fits those two together, and then we get down to the scheduling, which will come up in a later chapter, which is the detailed plan of how you implement. Okay, capacity is defined in this textbook as maximum output that can be produced over a given period of time. That should be taken in context, considering capacity really is the maximum output within the resources and constraints that you have to your available to you. There are theoretical capacity and actual outputs. We will talk about each of these concepts as well. Utilization is an important factor. It's how do you make the best use of your capacity, and it is defined relative to output and capacity. In other words, you divide the actual output you have by the capacity to determine what your percent of utilization actually is. Theoretically, you might be able to reach 100%, but in most cases, you're really, on a practical sense, realizing any place from 60% of your capacity up to mid-90s. Facility decisions are important so that you can optimize the capacity that you have, and you start with some of these decisions, such as location. In some types of business, you will find that location is one of the most important things even before you start considering other issues. When you develop a strategy for a facility, you have to keep in mind what the quantifiable amount of capacity is that you have in terms of units of production or other throughput that you're going to be measuring in your organization or system. What is the timing of any changes that you have to make? Because as we said in earlier chapters, you're always going to be making changes to your processes depending on what the order requirements are. And what types of facilities do you need in the overall picture? You may modify your facilities for near-term needs, but in the long term you have to keep in mind what the total investment costs are. Other factors that come into play are the demand that you forecast, the cost of the facilities, what your competition is likely to do, and as well as the global impact of any of the decisions that you make. Okay, when we talk about capacity and we talk about 100% utilization, there's several factors that have to be considered. One is described as the cushion in your capacity. And where this comes into play is when you're especially making to order or making a lot of customized work, you have to allow a certain amount of cushion for the change in the type of work that you're doing, because it's very difficult to determine the exact capacity and your ability to produce in less than a continuous run, large volume type of operation. With cushion, what we do is we fall back on inventory to balance some of our needs, and in that sense we sometimes make to stock. As we said in earlier chapters, you want to minimize the amount of cushion you have in your inventory. Okay, we're always looking at economies of scale. We're looking at production costs, we're looking at how we spread our overhead and apply it to the particular units of production. Obviously, we try to maximize the production units and processes in order to do that. On the other hand, there are what we call diseconomies of scale as well. Certain types of work, or depending on where the customer is, may result in transportation costs that are not according to standard. Some type of work requires more administrative bureaucracy, especially government work. When you get government contracts, there's an increased demand by the customer to oversee and control the job and the process, which is going to cost you a lot more money. And depending on the type of organization, type of business you have, sometimes you'll have organizational complexity. This is one reason why many organizations today try to break down their operations to what we call strategic business units, or SBUs, and in essence try to make them operate more lean and mean like a smaller company might have to do. With respect to facilities, your biggest issues are how your capacity positions you vis-a-vis your competition, and how you can bring into play the cushion factor, which we mentioned and you'll study about in this chapter. There are all types of strategies to attempt to minimize risk, and those strategies on a case-by-case basis will be evaluated by the student as well. When considering location that we mentioned before, there are quantitative factors that have to take place. Return on investment and net present value are two of the financial bottom lines that you always want to look at when making a decision. Some other factors that are important, things like transportation. In other words, how far away are you from either your supplier or your market? Taxes, state by state, the tax issue can be very different. Many years, about 15 years ago, that's one of the things that caused a lot of businesses to leave California and go to other states because the tax burden was so high. And the lead time factors, which ties back to our transportation and logistics issues. There are qualitative factors as well, such as the local employment culture of the people there, their attitudes, and proximity to all of the stakeholders that we mentioned before. Different types of facilities exist, and there you have to look at the business you're in and determine what the best facility in terms of processes and capabilities is with respect to the business that you're doing. Some businesses are product focused, some are more market focused. In other words, they will change their products to serve the market as its needs change. Some businesses are very process focused. They just say, here's what our processes and our capabilities are, and we will try to apply them to whatever you need us to make for you. And some are more general purpose. Those are very specialized businesses. They have a harder time surviving in a long run because if they're not able to match their capabilities to the demand. Sales and operations planning. It's all about matching your capabilities to your demand and then translating it to an implementation strategy. You can look at demand in different perspectives. Aggregate level of demand really usually is applied to product type of operations. You have to look at the objectives you have as management and try to match up your capabilities to that. Okay, we always talk about cross-functionality, and that's true even in this chapter. You have interests and contributions from each of the functional capabilities, such as engineering, human relations, operations, material management, finance, etc. And each of them have a role to play that, as we said before, comes together in an integrative operation. Let's see, concurrent planning, we're always emphasizing that, which allows you to get more efficiencies into your plans. Okay. You have different options on how to choose strategies. One is to pick your strategy to follow your demand or to chase your demand. And in those type of situations, your customer is a very important factor and force. And you're oriented towards delivering according to promising. Supply is another concern. Some operations tailor their whole processes and all of their decisions according to what their proximity to their supply sources are. That, of course, drives the operation from a different, and it ties into what we talked about earlier in push-pull type of options. There are considerations that management has to make in all situations. Pricing is one of the most universal ones and the one that most people concern themselves with, but strategically it's not always the driver. You look at how much advertising promotion you have to do. You have to look at the demand to determine what kind of a backlog do you need in order placement. And you have to look at your whole product line to determine what the full scope of the product line needs to be if you're going to satisfy your demand. A lot of operating type of decisions have to be made by management. Hiring and laying off of employees is important. The thing that most management teams try to do is stabilize their operations, because if you're hiring and laying off continuously, you have other issues as well. You have efficiency issues and you have training requirements that are constantly becoming part of your burden. Inventory, as we've said quite often, becomes important because you have to decide how much inventory to build up or carry. And even your sourcing capability, your subcontracting, your suppliers, and how you develop and maintain relationships with them depends on how you plan your operations. One production strategy is what we call a level strategy, which means that you try to level both the schedule, the volume, and the workforce to maximize or optimize your efficiencies. Inventory in that case becomes more of a buffer that says you use inventory to help level your operation. A chase strategy really is one that works more in response to a demand, where you're going to be varying your workforce according to that demand. You're trying to minimize your inventory, and the penalty you suffer is most likely getting inefficiencies that go up and down based on what your level or what your situation is. A level load strategy, as we mentioned, delivers the products and services at a constant rate, and it tries to minimize the costs and the mistakes of making changes. A chase strategy, on the other hand, you produce only what you sell. It's very responsive to your demand and your customer, and it operates most likely in a just-in-time type of environment. And basically it says if there are no sales, don't produce. And this is more oriented to a service type of business where inventory doesn't have the same influence as a product-oriented business. Okay, with aggregate planning costs, this is a more big picture approach. You have to balance all of the things we've been mentioning: hiring and firing costs, overtime costs, subcontract costs, inventory costs, and stock out situations. You have to put that all in balance to make what we call an aggregate decision on how to run your business.